Hi, U.S. history. We are talking about the Kennedy presidency today. This is a harder lecture because there are a lot of different aspects and facets to the Kennedy presidency. There's a lot going on in the early 1960s. In fact, my family thinks I'm a little bit skeptical. They're a little skeptical that I can pull this off, but I'm gonna give it a shot. Okay. Um, it's day like 15 of quarantine. We're just doing the best that we can. So Kennedy, when he comes into the presidency in 1960, he is really unlike any other president that we've seen up until this point. No offense to the presidents that we've had up until this point. They're wonderful men who did wonderful things. God rest their souls. But they were, for the most part, kind of these like old white guys. Kennedy comes in 1961. And he's young and he's charismatic and he has friends with all these movie stars and Marilyn Monroe and athletes and all of these different people. He's from this well-connected, wealthy family. He speaks well. Women love him. He has a following. He's kind of like a celebrity. And so he's unlike any president that we've had up until this time in American history. He's also, just for a note, the first and only Catholic that we've ever had as president, which is kind of an interesting note when you think about all the different presidents that we've had. They've all identified as Protestant Christians. Kennedy's the only one who's identified as a Catholic, and he actually faces some discrimination for that. But again, he's unlike any other president because he's young and because he's charismatic. He brings a lot of energy into the office. People are excited when Kennedy gets elected about the things he's going to do as this young president. And so when he gets into office, he makes America a promise. He says, listen, things have been good. The 1950s is characterized, like we've said, about prosperity, the beginning of the civil rights movement. Things are exciting. America is wealthy. People are back to work. The war is over. He goes, I'm going to keep that going. And in fact, I'm going to make it better. I'm going to bring America a new frontier. That's his domestic policy. His in-house, in America policy is a new frontier. And there's a couple different aspects to this. He wants to bring education to more Americans. And when we're talking about education, we're really talking about college. He wants more Americans to go to college. He wants to extend health care to more Americans. He wants more Americans to be covered for health insurance purposes. He wants the economy to keep booming, right? So he wants to build on that post-war 1950s prosperity throughout the 60s. He also wants to keep civil rights progressing. He sees the beginning of a civil rights movement forming with the Montgomery bus boycott, with MLK joining. He sees all this happening and he wants to keep that moving. He quickly becomes an ally, an early ally of the civil rights movement, which a lot of people would argue why it's so successful is because they have the friendship, that partnership with the federal government and the president. But in 1962, there's a book that comes out called The Other America, and it basically looks at poverty in the United States and says, yeah, the economy is booming, but not everybody is benefiting from it. There's a lot of Americans, especially urban Americans, people living in cities, who are not benefiting from the national wealth that we see in the economy. And so Kennedy looks at this and says, we need to improve on this. We need to make Americans, everyday common Americans, kind of feel that prosperity too. It shouldn't just be business owners, CEOs who experience this prosperity. It should be everybody. So he extends the minimum wage. He extends Social Security. He develops a welfare system to help Americans, like with food stamps and things like that, get the necessities that they need. He encourages Congress to pass something called the Equals Pay Act, which basically says if you work in the same industry as someone else, if you have the same job as somebody else, you should make the same amount of money. So if I have the same job as a man, then I should make the same amount of money as that man. Or if I'm a different race than somebody, then we should both make the same amount of money if we're in the same industry. So the Equal Pay Act is meant to bring more money, wages, higher wages to people who had been discriminated economically up until this point. He also gives tax breaks to middle-class Americans. He raises taxes on upper-class Americans, which is still an idea that's very popular among even the presidential candidates that we hear from today. That's something that we hear a lot in the Democratic Party, which Kennedy's a Democrat. Is that we want to raise taxes on upper-class Americans and give tax breaks to lower and middle-class Americans. So Kennedy is doing a lot on the domestic front within the United States to try to help people, again, kind of overcome poverty, become educated, and have new opportunities that way. But what Kennedy is probably best known for is his Cold War strategy and his Cold War influence. He does a lot overseas. Even though his domestic policies are important, he's remembered his legacy is definitely his overseas policy. So Kennedy, when he comes in, remember, he's young, he's charismatic, people are, motivated and confident that he's going to do big things. And he comes in and he says, you know what, I'm going to win the Cold War. Now, we know that doesn't happen. It takes a lot longer. The Cold War doesn't end until 91. But Kennedy comes in 1960. He says, you know what, you guys don't worry about it. We're going to win the Cold War in my 4 years that I'm president, okay? God rest his soul, Kennedy. But he comes in and he says this. He says, but I can't do it by myself. Okay, I need you to get involved. So he gives a speech in 1961. We've all heard this line before. And in that speech, he says, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, right? Now, we've heard this again a million times before in tons of different contexts. When Kennedy actually says this line, he's talking about the Cold War. And he says, listen, I'm going to do my part, but you have to do your part too. If we're going to win the Cold War, then we all have to be involved. And so the question becomes, what does he mean by that? What's my part? Now, for Kennedy, a lot of that is, well, it's a couple different things, but a lot of it is join the military, because Kennedy, one of his big Cold War strategies is something called flexible response. That's something, if you're taking notes, you want to circle. You can't play from your iPhone right now. It's something that you want to circle or you want to underline. He basically says, the United States needs to be flexible. We need to be ready for any type of conflict that the Soviet Union throws on us. So whether it's a land conflict, an air conflict, a sea conflict, a nuclear conflict, no matter what it is, whatever they throw at us, we got to be ready for it. And so one of the ways he thinks that's going to happen is by building up the military. He is not as focused on building up weapons like we see in the 1950s with the hydrogen bomb and all that kind of stuff. That was the 50s. The 60s is more about building up the military. So you have a boost in the Army and the Navy and Special Forces, all of those divisions of the military. More and more Americans are enlisting because, again, Kennedy is asking them to do their part in order to bring about an end to the Cold War. Okay, so that's his overall strategy, this idea of flexible response, building up the military, being ready for anything. Okay, now remember, we're still guided by the Truman Doctrine and containment policy. We want to contain the Soviet Union, right? We want to contain the spread of communism. So Kennedy, he pulls out his globe. He starts looking around the world saying, where's communism going to spread next? Now, we got to go back a little bit to understand this. But right after World War II, you have an era called decolonization, where basically all of the Europeans say, we just fought against Hitler and we were spreading democracy and freedom. And it's kind of hypocritical for us to have, ownership of most of the world in colonies. So during this era of decolonization, the Europeans, they basically just give independence to their empires, okay? So whether that be in India, basically all of Africa, much of Latin America, all of these colonial empires, they're freed after World War II, okay? Now these are young, vulnerable countries, right? They're just getting their start, just got their independence. Kennedy looks at them and he's worried about them because he thinks that communism is likely going to spread there next. Now, these different areas, these regions around the world, we call them the third world. Now, if you look at the map on the PowerPoint slide, on the Developing the Third World slide, there's a map in the corner and you can see it's color coordinated. Anything in green, this is what we call the first world. So these are wealthy countries that are developed. They've had industrial revolutions. They have technological aspects. They typically, again, are like the wealthiest countries in the world. So you can see that would be basically all of North America, as well as Australia and Western Europe. Okay, these would be, the winners of World War II and what will be the winners of the Cold War later in the 90s. Okay, then you have the second world. This is the Soviet Union. They're kind of in between. They have a little bit of development, but they're not as prosperous as the first world, as Western Europe and the United States. Then you have the third world. Okay, this is basically all of the former colonies that, again, have been decolonized in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So this would be Latin America, most of South America, basically all of Africa, much of Southeast Asia, These are, again, our countries that used to be colonies. They've historically been exploited. So they are still, many of them, very, very poor, have very unstable political systems. They lack education and basic resources. Again, all of the effects of colonization have left them in a place where they are much lower in status than the first and even the second world. And so Kennedy looks at the third world and says, these are new countries that are very poor. They are under the threat of communism. We have to help them, okay? Now, he doesn't want to go in and take them over, right? He's going to do it a different way. And so the way he decides to do it is through something called the Peace Corps, which still exists today. You can still, if you're a college student, decide I'm going to go join the Peace Corps. It seems like a pretty cool thing. This is a Kennedy invention, and it's actually invented under the context of the Cold War. He thinks, if we can send American volunteers to the third world to assist them with their development, meaning that we bring education and we bring them medicine and we bring them technology and we bring them all this stuff, just like the Truman Doctrine, we can convince them that democracy and capitalism are better than communism and dictatorship, okay? So while Truman did this with cash, remember Greece and Turkey, remember the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift? This is Kennedy's version of that. He's gonna send volunteers to bring all of these different services, education, healthcare, all this stuff, in order to convince them, the third world, that democracy and capitalism are the way to go, okay? He also forms an alliance with Latin America called the Alliance for Progress, where he's going to form more trade agreements, that he's going to try to give more goodwill to a region that historically has been exploited by the United States. And again, this new alliance is meant to keep them capitalist, friends of the United States, rather than side with the Soviet Union, okay? But what Kennedy is best known for is something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is it's a mixed bag for Kennedy. It's a little bit of good and it's a little bit of bad, okay? In 1959, you have a communist leader who comes to power in Cuba. His name is Fidel Castro, okay? Super bad dude. America does not like him historically. Just died recently. Still one of the, arch enemies of the United States all the way up until his death a couple years ago. So anyways, in 1959, this guy comes to power. And he's a communist, right? And so he becomes friends with the Soviet Union. They form an alliance. Now, when Kennedy comes into the presidency in 1961, he decides that he's going to break diplomatic relations with Cuba. So because Cuba is now communist, we're not going to have any association. We're not going to trade with them. We're not going to travel with them. We're just going to basically cut off relations with them, okay? Now, at the same time, Kennedy realizes that back in the early 50s, when Cuba is starting to become communist, you have the former President Eisenhower, who had developed this plan with the CIA to basically overthrow Castro, okay? So when Kennedy comes into the presidency, not only does he break off relations, but he looks at this plan and he says, I think this is a pretty good one. I think we can overthrow Fidel Castro. And if we can get rid of their communist government, then we can instill our own power there, okay? Now, the problem is this is a terrible plan. Like, this plan that the CIA has, it's not planned out well. It's not executed well, but Kennedy's just going to go for it, okay? So April 17th, 1961, you have this American invasion to Cuba. It's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. We invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. We actually send 1,400 Cuban exiles. We do not send American soldiers. We send Cuban exiles, which means that you have Cubans who fled from Cuba when it became communist and came to the United States. We are going to train them. We're going to give them guns, except we're going to give them like really low grade guns, ones that barely work. And we're going to send them back to Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. That's the plan, okay? So at the Bay of Pigs invasion, we send these 1,400 Cubans back over to Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. And you can imagine what happens. Only 300 of them make it back to the United States. It's a complete disaster, okay? Kennedy, though, takes full responsibility for it, okay? He says, this was my bad. This is my fault. The failure of this invasion is on me. It's not on these Cuban exiles or even on President Eisenhower, the guy who originally planned it. I'm taking responsibility for it, okay? This is seen as like the big blunder, the big mishap of the Kennedy presidency, okay? So a little bit more time goes on. Fidel Castro is still in power in Cuba. 1962, the CIA finds out that the Soviet Union is storing nuclear missiles in Cuba because remember, they're friends. They have this alliance. Basically, the Soviet Union says, hey, The United States, they want to take out Castro. If you let us put weapons, nuclear weapons, on Cuba, on the island, we'll protect you from the United States. And this sounds great to Cuba. They need the protection. The U.S. has already tried to invade once. What's to stop them from doing it again? And so they start storing weapons on the island. Now, once the United States finds out about this, we can't have this because Cuba is literally like 70 to 90 miles off the coast of Florida. It's really close proximity. So this is a big threat to the U.S. mainland. So Kennedy says, hey, you got to take those missiles off the island right now. Okay. And so he starts making basically all these threats. If you don't do it, we're going to blow you off the face of the earth. Now, when we talked about the arms race a couple weeks ago, we talked about a strategy called brinkmanship. When you basically bring your country to the brink of war by making lots and lots of threats that intensify over time. This is the best example of brinkmanship during the Cold War. What you see happening is you have Khrushchev, who is the guy in charge, the dictator of the Soviet Union at the time, and Kennedy exchanging threat after threat after threat. And this goes on for 6 days. For 6 days, they make constant threats to each other, basically saying that they're going to blow each other off the face of the earth, to the point where literally Americans are hunkering down in the bunkers that they've made in their backyards and counting their, their jars of food because they think that the United States is within hours of nuclear war. And to be honest, we really are. I mean, we basically have our codes in and our finger on the button, just waiting for the Soviets' next move. Now, the goal of brinkmanship is to, again, convince the other side that you just might be crazy enough to do it. And this works in this case, right? Khrushchev eventually decides, I'm not going to take the U.S. on here. I'm going to back down. And he actually does remove his missiles from the Cuban island. And so Kennedy wins this one. And in a lot of ways, it makes up for the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion because he had basically took the United States out of a nuclear disaster situation. Now, it doesn't work out very well for Khrushchev. When he gets back to the Soviet Union, there's a coup who overthrows him, and he gets replaced by a guy named Brezhnev. So this is a major defeat for the Soviet Union and a big win for the United States. Another big win for the United States, but it kind of works out bad for Germany, to be honest, in the end, even though it's a major win for us. Throughout the 1950s, remember we talked about how you have a lot of East Berliners who are moving to West Berlin because the conditions are much better. East Berlin is communist, West Berlin is capitalist. And so remember when we talked about how a lot of East Berliners were moving to West Berlin, then you have the Berlin airlift and it saves that region. You still have more and more people who are moving there because things are just better off in the capitalist part of the city. Now, this is also embarrassing for the Soviet Union. So in 1958, they make a plea to the US and basically say, hey, let us take the city off your hands. Let us just have the whole city and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. There's no way Kennedy's going to go for this. So in 1961, at this conference in Vienna, they're discussing this issue of Berlin, and Kennedy tells Khrushchev, no, listen, I am not going to give you Berlin. Like, I'm keeping the west side. You can have the east side, and we'll see how that works out for you. Khrushchev asks again. Kennedy says no. And so Khrushchev finally throws up his hand and says, fine, if you won't give it to me, then I'm going to build a wall, right? Because I can't have people escaping to your side anymore. This is where we get the beginning of the Berlin Wall in 1961. It does not fall until 1989. And so we have this like almost 30-year period where there is literally a wall erected between the east and west side of Berlin. Now imagine living in a city like Walnut Creek, for instance, and there's a wall separating out both sides of the city. If you have family or friends on the other side of that wall, you go years and years and years without seeing or communicating with them. And so this is a major intensification of the Cold War because not only do we have, the brink of nuclear disaster in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but you also have the intensification or intention building in Western Europe, in Berlin as well, okay? The Cold War is further exasperated, not only in Cuba, not only in West Berlin, but also in space as well. Everybody take a second and look up at the moon, okay? The reason we know what it looks like is, President Kennedy. Again, July 1958, NASA is created. And Kennedy, again, new frontier. He wants to make America better. He wants to win the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War is just a rivalry in a bunch of different areas, right? We've talked about it's a rivalry in arms. It's a rivalry in terms of wars like Korea. We'll get to Vietnam in a couple weeks. It's a rivalry in a lot of different areas. And another one of those areas is space. Okay, so the US and the Soviet Union start competing over who can get to the moon faster. Okay, and most of this happens during the Kennedy presidency. 1961. Kennedy again comes on television and says, I'm making you a promise, America. I'm going to get you to the moon and back safely during my 4 years. Okay, so he makes this promise to the United States, and this sets off what we call the space race. Again, it's a competition between the US and the Soviet Union, a part of the Cold War, to see who can gain supremacy, power over space. It's not enough just to have, power over the globe. We need power over space as well. So it's focused on a bunch of firsts. Who can do all of these different things first? Now, for most of it, at least in the beginning, the Soviet Union just wipes the floor with the United States. They are the first one to launch a satellite to orbit Earth. It's called Sputnik in 1957. We respond a year later with Explorer 1. This is our first satellite that orbits Earth. They are the first, the Soviet Union is first to send a man into the moon, into space. 1961, they do that. We respond again a little bit later, about a year later, with sending a man into space. And so it's building and building, but it's Americans who get the win in the end, because even though the Soviet Union is the first to send up a satellite and the first to send a human into space, the United States in 1969 is the first to send a man actually to the moon. And this is where you have Neil Armstrong and you have Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11. They are the first to set foot on the moon in 1969. This is, of course, when Armstrong says his infamous quote, "One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." And you guys, I think I have a video on YouTube that I assigned for today or for tomorrow so that you can watch. It was actually televised. You can watch Americans put a man on the moon for the first time. And so Americans win this aspect of the Cold War, the space race, okay? But it's not always a win for President Kennedy. In the end, we know that it ends in tragedy. November 1963, Kennedy is at the height of his popularity. I mean, Americans love this man, okay, because he not only is young and charismatic, but he is, sending Americans to space and to the moon. He is seemingly winning in the Cold War because he is taking control of the third world. He is... He held off the Soviet Union in Berlin. He held them off in Cuba. So Americans love this guy, okay? So he is actually starting to campaign for re-election. In 1964, his 4 years will be done. He's up for re-election. And so he goes to Dallas, Texas, to start his campaign. And he decides, I want to be seen. I want people to see me. So I'm going to drive around in a convertible, which we know this is usually bad news. And so he starts driving around the streets of Dallas, Texas with his wife, Jackie Kennedy, in 1963. And he's shot in the back of the head. And you guys will see a video on this in the lesson plans, I think, tomorrow. I have a video for you of this because it's all televised. And so Kennedy, you can see some pictures on your slide. Those are all real photographs from that day. But he's shot in the back of the head. Now the CIA, they arrest a man named Lee Harvey Oswald. And they say that Oswald, he fired 3 shots while sitting on up in a window of the 6th floor of something called the Texas School Book Depository. It's kind of like a library for this school. And so they basically say this guy, he was sitting up on the 6th floor with his gun and he saw Kennedy go by and he shot him 3 times and he hit him in the back of his head. And that's how Kennedy died. And Kennedy dies. He's taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital nearby. He dies 30 minutes after being shot. Now, a huge investigation goes on in Congress, which is typical whenever a president is assassinated or there's an assassination, even attempt. Congress investigates it, kind of like the police would investigate a murder. And so they released their findings in something called the Warren Commission, which was actually released to the public. It was declassified a few years ago, and you can pick up a copy and you can read it. But basically, the Congress decides in this Warren report, the Warren Commission, that we were right, that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was the only shooter, and he shot Kennedy from the Texas School Book Depository. Now, You know, and I know that there are a million conspiracy theories surrounding Kennedy's death. Lots and lots of people think that he did not act alone. Lots of people think that the shot came from an area called the Grassy Knoll. I mean, there's a million different conspiracy theories out there. And they have interesting arguments. And a lot of people like to research those. You can definitely research them on your own time. But as far as the official investigation goes, you know, the story that we're sticking to is that it's Lee Harvey Oswald. He was the only shooter, and he fired those 3 shots, and one of them hit Kennedy in the back of the head. Now, how do Americans react? All this, again, plays out on TV. They are stunned. I mean, Kennedy was America's sweetheart. They loved his wife, Jackie Kennedy. I mean, she's this beautiful, graceful woman, and they just feel so bad for her. He has these 2 young children, and they can see his funeral on TV, and his 2 kids and his wife, and it just breaks America's heart. It's one of those moments that kind of marked a generation. So like my generation will remember 9/11. Your generation is going to remember COVID-19. Your parents' generation, they remember the assassination of JFK. It's one of those moments that kind of just burns into your mind. You know exactly where you were when you heard the news that JFK was assassinated, right? And so Americans are stunned and horrified and sorrowful and kind of wondering, where do we go next? And that's where we're going to get the next president, the vice president at the time who becomes president, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. So we'll be talking about him tomorrow. You guys are going to do a handout on LBJ tomorrow, and then we'll be talking about him more in the coming weeks because he's the president who starts off the Vietnam War, which we'll get to by Wednesday or Friday this week. So big stuff coming. I hope you guys are doing well. I miss you terribly. Quarantine's driving us all crazy, but get yourself some good snacks, watch some Netflix, do your homework, wash your hands, and hopefully I will see you all soon.